There are people who enter the church thinking they are pleasing God, but leave there carrying something that did not come from heaven. And the scariest thing, you don't even notice. It's hard to say, but it needs to be said. There are common practices within the church that, instead of attracting God's presence, open doors to the enemy. That's right. In the name of faith, many people have lived a false spirituality, feeding profane worship and participating in the Lord's Supper with hardened hearts. It may seem exaggerated, but it is not. Jesus himself warned about this. There are prayers that become religious mantras, praises that look more like shows, and hearts so full of pride that they completely forget what reverence is. That is why there are so many believers who are empty, discouraged, sick, not only spiritually but even physically. Yes, there are real consequences when we treat the sacred as if it were commonplace. Have you ever wondered why some people live in cycles of defeat even though they are active in the church? Have you ever stopped to think if the problem is not in what is done in the name of God, but without God? The service became routine, faith became a performance, and the altar became a stage. And it is precisely there that the enemy takes advantage of it, where there is an appearance of godliness, but a lack of true holiness. Today, I want to show you 4 seemingly harmless attitudes that are opening spiritual breaches within churches. Get ready, because maybe you'll find that something you thought was faith, it was spiritual deception in disguise. And the good news, there is time to change. But first, we need to face the truth head on. Let's do it? There are a lot of people who enter the church as if they were entering a concert. Lights, applause, emotion on the surface. But what God really seeks is reverence. When worship becomes a performance, the focus shifts from the presence of God to the human ego. You sing loudly, you jump a lot, but your heart is far away. This, my friend, is what the Bible calls unholy worship. Something without essence but with noise. Have you ever seen someone crying in praise, but leaving the church to live as if God were invisible? Well, this is the emotional faith that exchanges holiness for goosebumps. A faith that feeds on sensations but does not resist the silence of the trial. False spirituality disguises itself well. It even sings beautifully, but it runs away from the cross when it is called to die to the ego. The service became a showcase to show talent, but it was forgotten that the altar is a place of surrender. If someone asks what God feels when he sees this, the answer is there in Amos. He rejects it. He doesn't want music without brokenness, nor a stage with vanity. The sound can be tuned, but if the heart is full of religious mantras, repeating phrases only out of habit, it becomes noise in the ears of the Most High. Want a practical example? Before singing, pray. Ask, Lord, does my praise please you, or does it please only men? The worship that opens doors to the enemy is the one that closes the heart to God. Simple as that. When you sing to impress the audience and not to touch the sky, the supper gets cold and holiness becomes a distant memory. True faith doesn't need a stage. It needs surrender. And speaking of surrender, have you ever stopped to think about how many times we approach the Lord's Supper unworthily? Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 11:27. Strong, right? But necessary. Many people participate in the supper as if it were part of the worship schedule, without the slightest discernment of what they are doing. The chalice is sacred. The bread represents the body. And if a person goes there with a heart full of unholy worship or spiritual deception, he is putting himself under judgment. And it's not just spiritual. Paul makes it clear, because of this there are among you many weak and sick, and many that are asleep. V30. They sleep in the spiritual and physical sense as well. It's heavy but real. To participate without regret, without reverence, is like taking poison thinking it is wine. The supper is a time for self-examination, not for religious routine. False spirituality turns this memorial into a soulless ritual. The most curious thing, and sad thing, is that many think they are pleasing God just by being there. But they forget what Jesus said. Do this in remembrance of me. Luke 22:19. This is about remembering the cross, the blood, the cost of salvation. True faith understands that it's not about being physically present, but about being broken, aware, humble. It's about recognizing what He has done and how much we need Him. If one approaches the Lord's table with hands soiled with pride, with doors open to the enemy through unconfessed sin, the cup becomes a witness against him. God in His mercy still corrects, as Hebrews 12:6 says, "For the Lord corrects whom He loves." But do we need to get to this point to understand? Maybe the problem isn't the bread, but the heart that insists on repeating religious mantras without transformation. And when prayer becomes empty, what's left? There are people who think that praying is like pressing a button over and over again, waiting for something magical to happen. Jesus has already warned, and when praying, do not use vain repetitions as the Gentiles do, Matthew 6:7. And yet, there are those who repeat the same words as if they were religious mantras, as if the right formula were more important than the sincerity of the heart. But God is not deaf or an idol of stone. He is Father, and a father does not want memorized speeches. He wants real conversation. Think with me, when a child just repeats the same phrases to his father, "Give me this, give me that," what is the real connection in that? God wants to hear your soul, not your script. There are prayers that are so full of words and so empty of presence that they do not go beyond the ceiling. Therein lies the spiritual deception, thinking that noise convinces heaven. But what moves? God's heart is a broken heart, like that of the tax collector in Luke 18:13, who only said, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." You know when the person prays screaming, crying, squirming. But is the sky still silent? It is not always a lack of faith. Sometimes it's a lack of truth. Prayer is not a magical ritual. True faith is expressed with reverence and surrender, not with words thrown to the wind. If you don't know what to say, tell the truth. Even a sincere "Lord, help me" is worth more than 20 memorized and meaningless sentences. The prayer that opens the gates of heaven is not the one that repeats phrases, but the one that carries the weight of sincerity. On the other hand, the prayer that opens doors to the enemy is the one that comes loaded with vanity, pride, or the one made to impress those who are nearby. This is unholy worship. And while many remain trapped in a false spirituality that feigns intimacy with God, God's presence continues to wait for someone to speak to Him. For real. And when that happens, transformation is inevitable. Have you noticed how there are people who only feel that God is present when the music is playing loudly, or when someone shouts, "Glory to God"? If the room is quiet, the person says, "I didn't feel anything today." Well, therein lies the danger. Feeling-based worship is like building a house on the sand. When the wind blows, everything comes crashing down. John 4:24 has already reminded us, God seeks worshipers who worship Him in spirit and in truth, not in emotion and volume. True faith does not depend on a shiver or tear in the eye. It stands firm when the sky seems closed and the heart is weary. The problem with emotional faith is that it only works on good days, but in tribulation, evaporates. This is why many fall into false spirituality. They live from event to event, from service to service, but they cannot sustain a day in the desert. They forgot that the altar is not a place of feeling. It is a place of decision. I have seen people who worshipped with intensity, but at the first sign of silence, they walked away saying that God is gone. God's presence is not measured by what we feel, but by the truth we carry. Worshipping in silence with your heart torn and your knees on the floor is worth much more than dancing without purpose. And if you want to grow in this, start with Psalm 51:17. You shall not despise a broken and contrite heart, O God. When worship becomes just a resource to provoke emotions, it becomes profane worship. The danger. Opening doors to the enemy without realizing it, exchanging presence for performance and holiness for sensation. And if there is no vigilance, even inside the church, the altar can fill with strange smoke, as happened to Nadab and Abihu. But it's a separate conversation. Within the very house of God, a strange fire may be born. So it was with Nadab and Abihu, priests, the sons of Aaron, who offered incense with a semblance of holiness, but without reverence. What seemed spiritual was actually profane. The altar was filled with smoke that did not come from the presence of God, but from the will of man. And there a breach opened, doors opened to the enemy inside the sanctuary. Nowadays, this continues to happen. People with an appearance of piety, rehearsed language, and even authority on the microphone, but empty of fear. False spirituality. Within the church isn't loud, it's subtle. She dresses in zeal, but ignores forgotten holiness. It's like a counterfeit perfume. It deceives at first contact, but soon realizes that it didn't come from the right source. Such unholy worship is like a spiritual disguise. One even fasts, but with pride. He sings, but out of vanity. Well, but with religious mantras, repeating lifeless phrases. And all this builds a favorable environment for spiritual deception to spread. When the church fails to discern what is fire from heaven and what is strange fire, it loses spiritual sensitivity and gives up God's presence and does not even realize it. Want to know how to identify this? Observe the fruits. Where there is true faith, there is transformation. Where there is false spirituality, there is confusion, division, stardom. And the altar becomes a stage, the word becomes a speech, and worship becomes an event. That is why we need to watch seriously. Because in many temples out there, the fire still burns. But the question is, did it really come from heaven? Now that you've seen these 4 attitudes that even within the church can attract demons, the question that remains is, what are you going to do with it? Will you continue to treat the sacred as if it were optional? Or will you choose to live a true faith with reverence, holiness, and conscience? The decision is in your hands, and it changes everything. How many times have you partaken of the supper without discerning the body? How many times have you prayed just out of habit, repeating lifeless phrases? Have you ever stopped to think if what you call worship, God would call profane? And the deeper question, is your spirituality grounded in truth or in feeling? Maybe it's time to do some spiritual cleaning. Reevaluate the heart. Close the doors open to the enemy, and to allow God's presence to occupy the place that has always been His, the center. Because in the end, it's not about appearance, it's not about tradition, it's about communion with the Father. For real, with truth. If this message has woken you up, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Right here in the comments, I choose to live in holiness. I want to see who is willing to break away from spiritual deception and live what God really wants. And of course, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and come with us to dive into truths that liberate. The best is yet to come.